So, as the introduction said, Elixir was my first programming language. And I wanted to talk to you all about what that means to me, both in the sense of kind of what I learned, but more in a broader sense than just technical things. So actually what this talk is 8 encouraging things I learned using Elixir as my first programming language. I'll just get started. The first thing was jump in and take risks. So Elixir is great. Java sucks. That's my first thing I'm going to throw out there. I was working at a desk job. It was fine. It was working for me, but I knew that I wasn't going anywhere, right? And so I decided to go back to school and learn computer science. And I got the basics, I was doing really good, and then they introduced Java, and I was like, what is this? This is terrible. So then but I was really excited. I knew that this was something I wanted to do, and I was gonna try and do it. So I was telling everyone I knew that I was doing computer science, and I was gonna be a developer. And I started talking to my friend Rob, who you may have seen speak yesterday, Rob Martin, who's just a friend. And come to find out, he's also an advocate for juniors and women programmers, which was perfect for me. So he offered to interview me for an internship at OC Tanner. And I was like, yeah, sure, let's do it. And he's like, you're going to be working in this new language called Elixir. And I was like, okay, sounds great. And I went to the interview and ended up ending the interview by teaching one of the other women who was there parts that I had already learned in the 90 minutes. So by the end of the interview, I was teaching Elixir to someone else. So it made more sense to me than anything ever had. But it was a huge risk for me to take this internship. It was one of the scariest things I've ever done because it was 4 months and no guarantees after that. No guarantees of a job, no guarantees of anything. And how do you just leave this kind of going nowhere but job that you have that's steady and just jump in and say, I'm going to do this internship and don't know what's going to happen afterward? But it was so worth the risk. And so I really learned from that experience that jumping in and taking those risks is going to pay off most of the time, hopefully. I also, I went from OC Tanner to being a junior developer at a company called Big Squid. And that was really great. I thought that was like the perfect job for me, right? I was a junior developer and I was working in Elixir, and how awesome is that? And gradually I realized that wasn't the job that I wanted. That wasn't the job for me. And I loved working in Elixir, I still do. But being a developer just didn't fit me, who I am right now. So I took another big risk, and I left Big Squid, and I decided to apply for a variety of jobs. And I actually recently got hired as a Scrum Master at Circe Dynix, which is a library software company. And so I took the risk to go from there to where I am now, and I'm happier than I've ever been, and it's great. So yeah, jump in, take those risks, learn from everything, no matter what kind of craziness might come out of it. Part of taking risks and all of that leads me to my second point, which is confidence matters. It's so easy to lose confidence. When I was at OC Tanner, I was talking to some senior developers there, and I was like, you guys, I don't know what I'm doing here. This is terrible. I can't do anything. And they're like, I feel that way sometimes too. I'm like, what? You guys have been doing this for decades. How do you feel like you don't know what you're doing? But it really helped me for some reason to know that everybody has these confidence issues sometimes, right? We all get nervous. We all feel like, what am I really doing here? But to be able to say, no, I know this. I know what I'm doing, and this is awesome, and I'm going to take charge, do what needs to be done, was a huge shift for me. And so even though I still get nervous, and even though sometimes I don't know what I'm doing, I charge forward, and I maintain my confidence, and it's been a huge help for me. As I go through these slides, I'm going to have a couple of slides that are quotes, and they're Lexi quotes. They're things that I pulled from a journal that I was writing when I was working at OC Tanner and Big Squid. And I went over that journal to kind of pull together some thoughts for this, and I pulled out some things that I think are valuable. So as far as confidence goes, the theme of my working life is that I can do this. It's hard, but not as hard or as complicated as I initially think. And I found that with, not with Elixir necessarily, because I always found Elixir to be fairly easy, but just like grasping the more complex problems that developers have to face. A lot of times it seems like this big, huge thing, and how am I going to do this? And then you sit down, and an hour later you're done. We heard, Tim spoke about the pancreas. Was it Tim? Is his name? Anyway, he said that, he thought this huge problem that I'm going to have to tackle with this diabetes thing that I'm setting up. And then he went and sat down and did it, and boom, it was done. And so within Elixir, but also just within general thought, the thought of things can be a lot scarier than the actual thing, right? Another point to confidence, and that will lead me into my third thing, is to find people that are confident in you. Rob was a huge boost for me because I would see these things and be like, oh, I'm doing terribly. And he would remind me of all of these great things that I had done before and that I could do this. It might be hard right now. I might be looking at it from the perspective of I don't know what I'm doing. But I've been there before, and I can come out of it. And so the third thing is find your people. For me, talking to everybody I knew about this exciting new journey when I was first, getting into development was a huge step to finding people. And then talking to everybody I knew about this new language, Elixir, that I was learning, and I start to find these people that are interested in the same thing that I'm interested in. I've also found that finding your people can be in work and outside of work. And when I was working at OC Tanner, I worked with a woman named Gina who was like my perfect opposite. She's a vegan and I'm a meat eater. She is super smart and has all this knowledge in her head and gets kind of unorganized. I don't know what I'm doing half the time, but I know how to get things organized. And so I found that working with her, in fact, we started out our internship by mobbing, but we had a few weeks where two of the women were doing some other things, and it left me and Gina just together. And we started pairing, and I found that working with her and pairing with her was one of the best experiences in programming that I had. And part of that was just how well we complemented each other. And so I think it's really important to keep an eye out for those people, right? You're not always going to stumble upon them and be as lucky as I am. Sometimes you've got to go out there and look for them. You've got to go to meetups. You've got to go to conferences. You've got to go to some of these, the Elixir bridges that Anna was talking about. All of these things can be really great ways to find your people. But sometimes you just have to be open to the people that are around you anyway. And I think no matter how you decide to find them, I think finding people that can support you can be a huge boost. Part of finding people, too, is learning to not only learn, but teach. And so there's this idea that I have come upon, which is teach to learn. And my fourth thing I learned. Teaching to learn, initially, the thought that I had actually came from Jessica Kerr's talk in 2015, her keynote. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. It's amazing. But she talks about learning from people like on steps, right? So we're all on a step somewhere on this learning curve. And the people that you want to learn from are the people that are just one or two steps above you. And the people that you want to teach are the people that are one or two steps below you. And I totally agree with this. I love this. There's something that's just hard, no matter how much someone who's up here can be a good teacher and try and break it down for you. There's just certain things that they're going to miss. They're not going to do it on purpose, but that's just what's going to happen. And I have found that if you can find someone just one or two steps above you that's willing to teach you, you're going to learn a lot. But I'm going to take this a little bit farther and say, if you can find someone to teach, you are going to learn just as much, if not more, than if you can find someone to teach you. my example of that is I worked with this woman named Selena at Big Squid. And when I got there, I knew Elixir. I had been working in Phoenix, all that stuff. And she didn't really know anything. She'd had a little introductory experience in Elixir, but not much at all. And so I was tasked with kind of teaching her. And I ended up doing that somewhat, but she kind of got some personal instruction and some other things. And she kind of caught up to me pretty quickly. Number one, she was super smart, obviously, but she caught up to me pretty quickly. And then after that, we had this really cool experience of her finding something new and teaching me, and then my understanding got better and I taught her, and then hers got better, and we kept like teaching each other as we both got smarter, and it kept bringing our levels up, together. And kind of within that idea, when I help others who aren't as advanced as me with the simple problems, I start to understand the more complicated problems a little better. And that I have found to be really true. So I think that part of finding people is finding people that you can teach. Because if you really want to get beginners into Elixir, I think the best way is to find someone to teach it to. Because you're going to learn more, and they're going to learn more. And then we can start to get and build up this community, right? Which is what everybody wants. So the next thing is interesting. School is useful but can't teach you everything. Otherwise known as math is hard but Java is harder. School, to me, was really great to start me off. It gave me a basic understanding of computer, programming and what's an integer and all of that stuff. But it couldn't teach me all of the wonderful things that I've learned in the last year that I feel like I would not have learned if I had stayed in school and done that path, right? And I think that it's important for beginners to remember that there are so many resources out there, and I think it's important for people who are more advanced to continue to put out those resources, right? I think it's really awesome that there's such good documentation for Elixir and even for Phoenix. Sometimes it was hard for me as a beginner to kind of break down some of these more complex problems. But the great thing was that as long as I kept digging, it was out there. I could find it. And I think that a lot of us run into that, right? The traditional school path can work out great for some people, but for most people, it seems like you have to be motivated to learn. You have to be motivated to do things yourself and get yourself to where you want to be. I have another quote. No, I don't. Oh, that's a different thing. Just kidding. So my next point is keep it simple. And I think that kind of goes back to school is useful, but can't teach you everything, because sometimes I felt like in college things got too complicated, and I feel like simplifying things when you're learning is really important, but not just when you're learning. Rob's credo to us, and he talked about it in his talk, is simple, demonstrably correct code. And I'm going to talk about the demonstrably correct part in a minute, but the simple part was really important for me as a junior. Not because I felt like I needed to write simple code, but because he tried to get the seniors on the wavelength as us, right? So his idea was write junior code, and not code that necessarily a junior would write, but code that a junior can reason about. Code that isn't this high level of complexity. You don't need it to be complex. Elixir is beautiful because it's simple, because it doesn't need this complex level. So, bring it down in writing junior code, it was nice for me, to say. In fact, if you wrote code that was more than 5 lines, Rob would say you should probably make that simpler, because it shouldn't be more than 5 lines. If you commented something, oh boy, no, there's no comments. There shouldn't be, right? If you're writing Elixir, you should not need to comment anything. So with good variable names, I rarely have to bounce around to try and understand a function. Everything I need to understand is right there, and I can easily reason about it. And that is my raw thoughts on Elixir. and on working in Elixir was, as long as I could kind of understand the variable names and where you were going with that, I could figure out your code. And I think that it's important to keep that in mind, where we can start to get to a level of like, oh, this is a complex idea, so I need to write complex code. And you don't. You can simplify it and write code that I can read. and then it helps everybody. Before I move on, though, I have to tell you guys a funny story. So I'm working at this new company. I'm a Scrum Master, and they don't use Elixir or functional programming, which I'm not going to get into that. But they use Java. Gross. And the Scrum Masters were talking about how some of the devs don't comment their code, and like, oh, how annoying, and make sure that they get comments in. And the first thought I had was, why aren't they writing better code? If they have to comment it, they're obviously not writing very good code. And my second thought was, oh yeah, Java, never mind. So my next point is show your work. And this comes back to demonstrably correct, right? So the idea here is that you write simple code, but you also have to show that it works and that you can actually use it. And there's a couple things that I found to be helpful with that. The first was using IEX. And I know that a lot of you do. It's been great to watch these presentations and see people pulling up, the interactive Elixir and using it, because I would forget that sometimes. and whenever I went back and remembered that was like a huge important tool, it was the best way to start writing something. It was the best way to start getting these like test thoughts out there. Be like, what do I really want to do here, and what can I use? And so I'd look at docs and I'd test it in IEX, and then I'd go and start writing tests. Well, okay, maybe. Sometimes I'd write functions first. Don't tell Rob. But so I found that IEX was a great place for me to start, and then I'd work on that TDD, right? I have a failing test, and then, okay, now let's get it to pass. And it's actually, I heard some people talking in the hallway, and it cracked me up and made me very happy and made me think of this. The guy said, I have a failing test. And the other guy was like, yeah. And it's just great when you can have that test-driven development where you're excited because you have a test, and it doesn't matter if it's failing because you're going to figure it out, but you've got it. And I just love that. So I love this idea of show your work too, because a lot of these principles that I've said so far are somewhat universally applicable, right? You can apply them to life as well as to using Elixir or any other language. And I like this because I feel like this goes back to talking to everybody and putting yourself out there. Not just showing your work by proving that it works and being demonstrably correct, but also show your work and show it off. And show people how awesome this stuff that you're doing is, and how beautiful this language is. And it doesn't even have to be Elixir. Like I said, it could be your guitar chord that you've been working on for a while and you put on the internet or show off to your friends or whatever. I think that it's really important if you want to, take these life skills with you and find a way to build a community to show stuff off to people, because it's crazy how supportive we can be of each other. I very rarely have found, anytime I'm showing things off for people, that they're rude, right? It's usually like, oh, well, you could fix this, but, good job. And I think that we need to be brave and take that risk and show off what we're doing. It'll help people and help us. So the last thing that I learned in this crazy journey is to see the big picture. And I'm going to talk about this in two different ways. One is personal and one is professional. So for me, the personal big picture was that I don't always know what I'm doing, obviously, but that's okay. I'll get there in the end. And taking those risks and jumping in and being confident and talking to people and showing things off and all of these things have led me to a place that is surprisingly happy in a way that I didn't think I would ever be. And so the big picture for me is that, you can use all of these skills and all of these things that you learn in development and working through these problems, and you can take them home and use them for personal, development and no matter what that means to you. I also think that the big picture, what I'd love to get across with these thoughts, is that Elixir is awesome, and that it's really easy for a beginner. When I first saw the language, I was so happy that I finally had a way to use the concepts that I understood, and I didn't have to try and abstract them in this crazy object-orientedness. I could finally take these basic concepts that made sense to me and use them in a way that made sense to me. And I think it's super important to do what we can to get beginners in and to get this to be people's first language. I think that functional programming should, in my opinion, should be what everyone is taught first, because it's really hard to get out of this object-oriented mindset. But for me, I can look at object-oriented code now, and I probably can't write it, but I can definitely read it a whole lot better than I could back then. And part of that's just experience with code, but part of that is because I have this different mindset of what things are and how they should be set up. And so I think I really want people to just kind of take away from this that Elixir is not something anybody should be afraid to use, and people who care about it as much as we do need to be the ones that are out there advocating and saying, yeah, try this out. This is what we should be, what you should be learning, and grab those people, those newbies, and start teaching them. And again, if you teach them, you'll learn more, and it'll all come back around. Give me just one sec. All right. So yeah, teach people, take some risks, do all the fun stuff, and that's all I have. So any questions?
Okay, for questions, you can line up here, please.
Oh, I get a line. That's exciting. Oh, I have a lot.
Yay!
Good.
That's a lot of questions.
I was hoping we had a lot of questions because I figured I would get more value out of you guys asking me stuff. So.
Hi. I wanted to know what resources you found particularly useful as you were learning Elixir. Were you just learning it from coworkers, or were there things online that helped you grasp functional programming principles in Elixir in general?
So I used the website, the elixirlang.org was helpful. I bought the book, and I think when I bought it, it was still just a ebook, but that was really great. I actually read, the first half of the book I just read and went through all the problems. The second half was kind of some of the more advanced stuff, and I used that more as reference. But I loved having the book, was great for me. And then as I got more into using packages and things like that, I used Hex a lot and the package manager. It's a really great tool. It's easy to understand, and so, and everything's set up so similarly that you don't have to spend hours trying to dig through and find the documentation. It's very clear and you know what you're looking for, right? And so I loved packages that had really good Hex documentation, because then I could just go and I knew what I was looking for. So yeah, that's the website, the book, and then the Hex documentation were the three most helpful things besides getting help from people. So.
So there's a subreddit for Elixir, reddit.com/r/Elixir, and just about 2 or 3 days ago, somebody said, I want to learn Elixir for as my first language. And it seemed that the general replies were, you shouldn't learn this as your first language. So I'm guessing from your talk that you think this is not the case, and I would probably agree. And I think the reason they're thinking along these lines is they said, well, if you don't use OTP, then why are you learning Elixir? You have to get to that, otherwise you're not using its benefit. What would you say against this, or that it is a good language and why it is?
I think it's hard to compare because I've never had anything to compare to. But for me, it has helped me understand the simpler concepts. You can always make things more complex as you go, but to start off, it doesn't have to have that level of complexity, right? And so I think that on a base level, just like beginner Elixir is a really great way to get people into the right mindset to learn those more complex ideas. So that's what it was for me, was just this great base. And then I could kind of take it from there and see, I could start to understand more things. So like I said, probably couldn't sit down and write Java, but I can look at Java now and have a much better understanding of what's happening than I would have before. And I think that's because I have a good base that I have built off of. And you can always get more complex. But learning those simple basics first, I think we kind of forget that step. And Elixir helped me reinforce that step. So.
All right, great talk.
Thank you.
So I also teach beginners, and I find a challenging step is when, after some basic programming where people are just basically printing stuff on the terminal and doing simple tests like that, to get them excited about building something that they would like to show off, you have to have some kind of front end. And then I want you to tell me about, if that was included, how that was part of your journey.
So when we were doing I'm going to tell a little story. When we were doing the internship at OC Tanner, we actually used Elm. So when I say Elixir is my first language, it is, but most of what I did was in Elixir, but I also used a little bit of Elm, so cheated just a little. But so I've only pushed code in 2 languages, Elm and Elixir. But the individual project that I worked on was simply Elixir, nothing else. And for me, just having it work, I didn't necessarily need front-end visualization of that. I was just excited that it worked. And I think having a passing test, testing things in IEX and seeing the successful, it printed not just it printed words that I wanted it to, but I told it to do all these things and then tell me that it did a good job when it was done, and it did them and then did a good job. Those things were enough for me. I feel like something that might be helpful if you wanted to give people a little bit of front end would, you could always use Phoenix and do some of the Phoenix front end stuff that's involved with that, because I think that I worked in Phoenix a lot, as well as Elixir, and I think learning Phoenix pretty early was really good. And there is a little bit of that option for building in some front end to show some of that off. So that would be my other suggestion. But I think just reinforcing that, hey, it worked and it's awesome, and you've got these passing tests. How cool is that? That's still a visualization, even if it's not a pretty fancy one. So that's how I would. Yeah.
And we have one more question.
So your sense of excitement about Elixir is so palpable, which is really awesome. I'm curious, in my experience learning languages, there's always that initial ramp up of productivity where it's kind of working, you follow a tutorial or something and it feels like magic and is awesome, and then you sort of get to the intermediate stage where you have this dark night of the soul where nothing works and you want to do something at all complex. I'm guessing laughter is maybe other people experience that. Can you talk about, thank you. Can you talk about, because I didn't want to be the only one where everybody's what, I just was awesome right away. I'm curious if you could talk about maybe an experience you had in your sort of intermediate phase where things started to get weird, or conceptual sticking points for you, or things that you tried to learn several times and you just couldn't without, yeah.
So it's actually kind of interesting. I had, this might get a teeny bit personal. When I was working at Big Squid, I had some issues. And I was working on Phoenix. I was doing some Credo and some Elixir work and trying to clean up code that someone else had written. And in doing that, I wasn't doing a whole lot of actual like Elixir development, and part of that was my fault, and part of it was because of what was going on around me. I feel like I should have probably done something to keep up on that, but working in that, I actually kind of regressed a little, and I had to relearn a few basic concepts when I got back into doing some actual like Elixir development. So I think that yeah, it's important. If I could do it again, I would work on a personal project in the meantime, even if it was just like an hour a day, because I think that especially when you're first learning things and there's so much happening and I'm trying to figure out what's going on with Phoenix, and I want to have this like Elixir code too, but like when do I really have time? And so I think I still would have dedicated a little bit of time into keeping up those skills, because without that, I did have a little bit of regression. The good thing was that was also at the same time that I was working with Selena, the woman that I talked about, like learning from, and so having her to kind of bounce off of was the thing that got me back to where I wanted to be and got me even better. So yeah, that's definitely a thing, and I think that just keep pushing is the most important thing. It's easy to forget, especially when you're working. But yeah, did that answer your question?
Kind of, yeah. I wonder if there were specific things about the language.
Any specific things about the language? Not that I can recall off the top of my head. I mean, I could probably like look at my journal again. That's why I wrote that, because I kind of have a bad memory. So I can think of general things, but I sometimes forget those details. So I mean, I can look and see if there was anything, but off the top of my head, not really any specific concepts. Just that like I felt like sometimes Phoenix was different enough that I kind of had to keep up on both to really kind of understand, and that was kind of a bigger sticking point, I guess. So maybe that helps. Like working in Phoenix didn't always feel like working in Elixir, and I had to kind of balance the two to keep up on both. So yeah, I guess that would be the biggest thing. But, anybody else? Oh, one more.
I just wanted to say it's really cool. Your ability to reflect on your own learning is super impressive. And I would also argue that that's something that, having taught folks, or attempted, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, how to, getting into programming for the first time, that ability to sort of like have a self-awareness of what is working for you and to be resourceful around how to seek out help and all that is in my experience really critical. And I think it's really cool. And I would love, I realize this is an Elixir talk, but I feel like this could be shown to like coding boot camp, students, folks who are because there's so many useful tips. And also you mentioned you were journaling.
Yeah.
That seems like a really smart move, because I feel like it's the folks who can actually verbalize what in their own head, what is happening to them and what is happening in their minds and what are they struggling with and all that tend to make it through. So yeah, that's super cool. I would you should totally take it lots of places. So,
okay, thank you. Yeah, actually, real quick on the journaling thing, that was actually a suggestion from one of the guys that I worked with at OC Tanner, who was the first person who taught me Elixir. Rob wasn't the first person. He set me up with the first person who had kind of self-taught, and so he was actually not that much farther ahead of me when he taught me. So that was kind of an interesting idea that comes back to all of this, and I'm glad you brought it up, because even when I first learned it, I didn't learn it from someone who was super advanced. I learned it from someone who had done some self-taught things and took an hour and a half to teach me. And he's the one that suggested, he's like, you should write a blog. And I was like, I'm not going to write a blog. And he's like, well, then at least do a journal. But I think that's great, right? If you can do a blog, do a blog. And if you can't, then just I had a little reminder every day, go write in your journal. And sometimes my journal would be like, today sucks. And that would be it. But sometimes I would have a lot of interesting insight into what was going on. And so, I think that was super helpful. So anyway, thank you. Anybody else? Okay, cool. Well, then thank you.
Thank you very much, Lexi.